Hi everyone. So today's webinar is going to be on food regulation. So there's two different regulation authorities that we're going to look at. The first one is FSANZ and the second one is the HACCP. All right, so FSANZ is an independent authority organized by the government that develops food standards for the composition of food, the labeling, any contaminants that may be present in food, or to reduce or eliminate those contaminants, either produced or imported for sale in both Australia and New Zealand. So the food industry, as well as consumers, public health professionals, and government departments are within that responsibility for the food and work for FSANZ or with FSANZ on the food standards to ensure that the food remains safe for your consumption. And FSANZ also provides technical advice to governments on food policy issues. So the ultimate goal of FSANZ is to ensure Australia and New Zealand have a safe food supply and that the consumers are well informed about what food they're actually, or the ingredients of the food they're consuming. So it's their responsibility to develop standards around food manufacturing, labeling, processing, hygiene, and primary production. They're also responsible for informing consumers. They're responsible for organising food recalls, conducting research, as well as looking at scientific risk assessment and looking also at risk assessment advice for imported food as well. So there are four chapters for the Food Standard Code. The first one being the general food standard for labeling requirements, such as use-by dates or nutritional information. So all of these factors that are pointed out in this diagram here are legally required on all food that is present in Australia, that is packaged. So Chapter 2 talks about food production standards. And looking at specific classes of food, such as cereals, meat, eggs, fruit, and vegetables. So Chapter 3 looks at the food safety standards, and this is where HACCP comes into the steps. So HACCP is actually part of the HACCP is part of the Food Standards Code, and we'll be going into more detail with this in the second part of the lesson. So Chapter 4 looks at the primary production standards for food, including seafood, poultry, meat, and dairy. So this is a number of standards that set out to look at food safety requirements for primary production and processing of the meat or dairy, any carcasses, or as well as the meat and dairy for human consumption. So this is looking at the primary production stage. The businesses are also responsible for the production and the process and to make sure they control all food safety hazards that may occur in this production and processing of food. So the HACCP is the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, which is an internationally recognized food safety system. So their purpose is to identify and manage hazards, reduce the risk of food contamination, as well as developing, implementing, and ongoing operations for comprehensive food safety programs. So it's also to prevent customer illness, complaint, and contamination of food. So all food sellers must register with their local council and allow for qualifications or inspections to make sure they're upholding the critical control points. So it works by first identifying a hazard, analyzing or investigating the hazard and how it might come up in the processing or production of a food, looking at the containment of that contamination, looking at how you can prevent contamination by handling conditions in the processing and production of that food, and then looking at the points in the process that might be at risk and making sure we have steps in process for that. So if we have a look at this lovely summary here for the steps, so first you need to know the food product and what makes it safe. You then need to look at how to produce food products from start to finish by understanding the practical process and the production environment. When you're looking at this process, you then identify potential hazards or steps within that process where contamination could occur. You then put in preventative measures that control and limit the ability for contamination to occur. Now, it's not enough to just put these preventative measures in place. You actually have to monitor these critical points to make sure that the safety limits are actually being achieved. You also need to write down and keep records of this because this is the evidence that you will then present to your local council to show that you are actually upholding the law. And you also need to review and confirm to make sure that everything is working as intended. And if it isn't working or you are still getting breakouts of food poisoning or food contamination, what can be changed to make sure that it is working correctly? And I've kind of already just gone through those points in that diagram, so I won't go through it again, but you should be taking a few notes on these because you do need to know this. There may be a question that comes up in the end of your exam.